It's really a pleasure to be here. When Bill and I first started talking about the possibility of doing a talk based on my recent research in the history of Westbeth, we talked about different venues where we might give the talk, and I thought, well, I should do it in Westbeth. But we floated around a couple of different ideas, and I thought, well, that's cool, you know, anywhere in the village would be great. But as it worked out, we are doing it here, and I think it's perfect, and I'm really excited to be here giving this talk. When I was doing the research that led to the article from which my talk is developed, this was back in 2010. I was on a fellowship at the New York Historical Society. And if any of you have spent time or done research in the reading room at the Historical Society, you know how kind of august and elaborate and beautiful this sort of Beaux-Arts, late Victorian reading room is. And if you spend any time there, you also know how strictly observant the archivists are there of ensuring that all researchers follow the rules and a very sort of specific etiquette. While I was doing that research, so the research was on the industrial waterfront in New York, and I had a particular interest in trying to understand Westbeth's history, and I got into the archives here. So I took a little break from my work at the Historical Society and looked at the records here at Westbeth. Unlike the very strict rules that I was expected to observe at the Historical Society, I was escorted down into the basement, given a key to a room that was filled with filing cabinets and bankers' boxes stacked to the ceiling, and said, have at it. And you could use that photocopier. It's all yours. And I spent the next several weeks kind of in mesh, right, in these wonderful, wonderful records down in the basement. So this was before Sandy. A lot of those records got damaged as a result. But while I was doing the research, you know, I was in these sort of basement spaces, nearby recording studios, so there was like music wafting through the walls, certain scents were also wafting through the walls that you never find at the Historical Society. And I thought, wow, this is it. This is really awesome. And the research that came out of it was also really quite great, and I want to share that with you tonight. So thank you for being here. And let me start. Westbeth opened in May of 1970 here on what was at the time the western fringe of the village. The opening party was billed as a hot dog and beer bash, but it was also a prominent who's who of New York planning and arts circles. Among the people who were on the stage that afternoon were Westbeth sponsors, Roger Stevens, the chair of the National Council on the Arts, and philanthropist Jacob Kaplan of the Kaplan Fund, as well as Mayor John Lindsay, Kaplan's daughter Joan Davidson, Westbeth Administrator Dixon Bain, the poet Muriel Rouxier, and sorry, I'm just moving in the wrong direction. And Jen Jacobs. A local paper said that the opening had, quote, the heady atmosphere of rock music, gaily flapping flags, balloons, and the joyous shouts of children. That heady atmosphere seemed to many people to be a stark contrast with the depressed landscape of many of the surrounding blocks. And this is a point that I want to emphasize. There's a tension between the ambitious expectations of what a development like Westbeth represented in 1970 and the then current state of the surrounding landscape of near empty warehouses and dilapidated piers. And these are just a couple of images that contrast the sort of gaiety of the expectations with what was really seen as a quite desolate economic landscape at the time. Westbeth's hope sort of nestled right in the tension between the sort of desolation and the hope. What was this idea that a new form of real estate development could be the answer for future revitalization of the area. Westbeth sponsors hoped that the institution would be a new model for post-war real estate development. It was the first large-scale institutional conversion of industrial buildings into artist lofts. And its sponsors hoped that converting old factories into subsidized lofts would both foster the arts and provide a new way to revitalize post-industrial cities. Unlike an earlier model of urban renewal that had sought clearance of the 19th century landscape to build modern structures, Westbeth adapted the 19th century industrial landscape for modern use. For sure, artists and a few small private developers had been converting individual lofts for artists in neighborhoods like Soho, but Westbeth stood out, both as a nonprofit development for struggling artists who couldn't afford Soho, and because, of course, of its scope and its scale, the sheer size of the development. Ada Louise Huxtable, New York Times architecture critic and kind of official arbiter of taste in New York's built environment in the 60s, praised Westbeth's design, and she praised Westbeth's lofts, even if they couldn't compare with some of those in Soho. They can't, she argued, due to a lot of non-aesthetic factors, such as high cost of land, labor, construction, material, and money. Space is the greatest luxury in America today. But, she said, these are Olympian quarters compared to what's on the market in New York at geometrically increasing prices. And the ceilings are high, and the windows are large, and the plumbing works. For many of the optimists at the opening in 1970, things in the village seemed to be looking up. When Westbeth officially opened, many residents had already moved in. A group of community artists had mounted an opening exhibition in the complex's still yet unrented gallery spaces. Westbeth's 384 units housed more than 1,200 artists, and it already had close to another 1,200 artists on a waiting list. Across the street, just to the south, development had already begun on the West Village houses, a local private real estate development that was sponsored by activists like Jane Jacobs that tried to provide the kind of human-scale housing that Jacobs had championed in her writing and against which she had criticized urban renewal projects of the previous decade. The Bergen Sunday Record said that there are already signs that the local neighborhood, a depressing area of trucking, meat markets, and warehouses, shot through with handsome streets and some elegant federal period houses, is looking up. City planners and advocates for the arts, as well as developers, preservationists, and tenants organizations, all look to Westbeth as a model not only for artists, but also for the future of urban economies. Investment in the arts and cultural development seem to offer a solution for the regeneration of crumbling cities. I turn to this research because to me, Westbeth represents a kind of fascinating moment when developers, planners, and community groups turn their attention to these vacant spaces and obsolete industrial structures along the waterfront. And they looked to them in the 1960s as a solution for the future of post-industrial cities. But it also foreshadowed what would become a dramatic shift away from publicly funded civic projects. And indeed, one of the most enduring legacies of Westbeth, albeit an unintended one, was that it was a private real estate development. And I want to make a couple of points about what I see as the significance of this. Private development, whether by institutional sponsors like Westbeth's, or by community organizations like the West Village houses, or by profit-motivated companies, all only took off along districts like the West Village after urban renewal projects to build public and middle-income housing had been both defeated and discredited by anti-renewal activists. This is really a focus, one of the major points that I want to sort of explore tonight, I want to emphasize these tensions between private development and public development projects, and in fact show that private developments like Westbeth and the West Village houses succeeded only after public renewal projects had been discredited in the public eye. And in the process, I also want to gently re-examine some of the celebratory narratives of neighborhood activism that defeated some of these big civic projects in the 60s. So this is what I'm going to do tonight. This is the sort of roadmap, right? I want to first paint a picture of the Far West Village landscape in the 1960s. Secondly, I want to revisit the 1961 battle between village activists like Jane Jacobs and the City Planning Commission that ultimately defeated a plan for public housing on the waterfront. The defeat of this plan set the stage for the development of Westbeth. Third, I'm going to sketch out Jack Kaplan and Roger Stevens' motivations in founding Westbeth and talk a little bit about the process of changing zoning and city ordinances and of converting industrial buildings into studios. And then finally, I want to draw some conclusions about what I think the legacy of Westbeth was, specifically in the context of real estate development and the politics of housing and city planning in the 1960s. In brief, this is what I'm going to argue. Roger Stevens and Jack Kaplan saw Westbeth as a social project. They hoped that it would help individual artists and in turn promote the arts in America. They also hoped it would be a catalyst for the revitalization of marginalized manufacturing districts, both here and in other cities around the country. Stevens and Kaplan hoped that Westbeth would be a seed project that could be replicated for subsequent loft conversion. So the initial plan envisioned Westbeth as an incubator for the arts, providing regulated rents and abundant space. The idea was that artists would live and work at Westbeth for a period of 5 years while they established their careers and got themselves on their feet, before moving on and opening up the space to new artists. And so you would have this kind of 5-year cycle of artists moving in and out. Westbeth was also supposed to be a self-sufficient institution. The business plan expected that ground rents through the lease of retail, restaurant, and gallery spaces, these spaces like that which we're in right now, would pay for and subsidize artist rentals in upstairs studios. Once Westbeth opened, Stevens and Kaplan expected to recoup their initial investment and then reinvest it in other artist housing projects in converted industrial spaces throughout New York and in other cities around the country. Westbeth certainly did provide housing for moderate income artists, but it never served as the model for cultural philanthropy that both Stevens and Kaplan had envisioned. Instead, I think Westbeth's greatest legacy was the impression that it gave to private developers that conversion of old industrial spaces into living spaces had cultural and aesthetic value. Ultimately, I think that Westbeth represented a transitional stage in post-war urban development. It stood at once at the transition from urban renewal and public housing to private development and the eventual conversion to luxury lofts. So let's start. By talking about the landscape of the Lower West Side of this neighborhood in 1960. Depending on your point of view, this area in 1960 was either a slum in need of clearance or the quintessence of the organic neighborhood ideal championed by Jane Jacobs. One or the other. Once the most congested maritime district of the busiest port in the nation, the West Village, still in 1960, was comprised of an eclectic combination of residential and commercial buildings with multiple uses and very diverse populations. Many of the old finger piers, some of them dating to the 1870s, still supported dilapidated pier structures, but others were slowly slipping into the water. By 1960, New York's waterfront looked like a shell of the prosperous industrial port that it had been only a couple decades earlier. Abandoned factories and warehouses maritime hotels, bait, tackle, and boat repair shops, boarding houses, tenement buildings, and 19th century row houses could be found on almost every block. It was about as mixed use and socially diverse as you could get. Nonetheless, the neighborhood could be divided by its three major north-south streets. West Street served as the marginal street, separating the piers from the city's streets and the neighborhood homes and businesses to the east. Washington Street, both kind of socially and geographically, divided the industrial and maritime businesses to its west from the blocks of mostly residential buildings to its east. While Hudson Street divided the mixed-use blocks of the far west village from the more middle-class neighborhoods of the village to its east. And now I know, right, that Greenwich Street is in there, but you've got to sort of humor me because this tripartite division really does work, and it's division that city planners used as well. It was part of the way that they were mapping out the plan in 1961. Further sort of dividing things were the elevated highway and the elevated train tracks. Now the Highland that furthers kind of really graphically demarcated functions and social uses by physically dividing the landscape, and most significantly dividing West and Washington streets and sort of carving out this corridor where Westbeth is right now. Through the 1950s, questions about what to do with disinvested industrial areas like the Far West Village and tensions between local communities that feared both displacement and the transformation of their neighborhoods permeated planning discourse. And of course, they also permeated the politics of urban development. After a decade of contentious battles over the displacement of communities to make way for urban renewal projects, city planners in the early 60s started looking to industrial corridors, like the area stretching between West and Washington streets, as more politically neutral spaces for development. And part of the argument here, right, the thinking, was that if you're going to look to a space of former industrial buildings, you don't run into the obstacles of displacing residents, and thus unleashing the kind of reaction that a lot of projects, most significantly in many people's minds, Lincoln Center, had resulted in, with the displacement of peoples to make way for new modern projects. Here, between West and Washington streets, the old Bell Labs represented just the kind of peripheral urban space that seemed ideal for public housing. Bell Labs had always stood out along the industrial waterfront as an elite center of scientific research. Alongside all of the warehouses, factories, maritime hotels, Siemens bars, butcher shops, etc., the scientists at Bell Labs had invented the talking picture, the television, high-fidelity sound, and transistor electronics. But by 1960, Bell Labs had moved its research facilities out to New Jersey. In a press release that Bell Labs produced shortly after this move, it said that, quote, the building itself, here it's referring to the complex of buildings that were Bell Labs and that are today Westbeth, the building itself is obsolete, obsolescent, or both. These kinds of sentiments, right, really reinforced ideas that the entire area consisted of nothing more than blocks of urban detritus, all in need of clearance and renewal. However, many of the people living in the blocks of federal townhouses just across Washington Street resisted characterizations of their neighborhood as blighted, and they challenged efforts to clear adjacent land to build public housing, especially right next to their newly renovated townhouses. And this is an important element in the story and understanding the social geography of this area in 1960. But by 1960, a new constituency of middle-class villagers had very recently moved in to this old 19th century housing stock. The old federal houses, right, that had originally been built in the 1830s were of course built as middle-class housing, at that very sort of transitional moment between the village being an agricultural sort of outpost and getting incorporated into the city itself. They had very long since been converted into multiple family dwelling units that served as homes for the working class, mostly immigrant residents, many of whom worked along the industrial waterfront here in this area. But after World War II, as industries started leaving the area, and as property values along the waterfront began plummeting, the village's 19th century townhouses underwent economic and social transformation. A new generation of middle-class New Yorkers recognized the aesthetic and historic value of these old federal-style houses. They started buying them and renovating them and turning them back into single-family homes. Newspapers in the 1950s followed these renovations and wrote about them with great energy and verve. And they're an excellent resource to get an understanding of exactly what was going on, what transformations were happening in the area. They marveled, right, at what they would often refer to as the neighborhood's return to a gracious era. One local villager even called his neighborhood Bohemia Gone Bourgeois. By 1960, this new middle-class community of bourgeois bohemian lawyers and journalists and ad execs, as well as other kinds of professionals, had emerged in the West Village with a particular kind of social and political capital that enabled them to assert their own ideas about neighborhood planning. They tapped into this larger dissatisfaction with big renewal projects of the previous decade. And this resentment also coincided with a growing interest in historic preservation, which of course they themselves were engaged in as they were implementing, right, preservation into this old 19th century landscape. And they also tapped into new ideas about community participation in neighborhood planning. Recent successes in the neighborhood in the 1950s, restricting traffic from Washington Square and saving the Jefferson Courthouse, only bolstered their enthusiasm. And as a result, we start to see the emergence of new kinds of neighborhood organizing committees with this sort of new form of political and social capital. And they were able to form a coalition with pretty powerful officials in municipal and federal agencies, all interested in a new liberal commitment to investing in the arts and cultural stewardship. So that's my kind of take on framing, right, that landscape. I want to now turn to these narratives of resistance that revolve around the 1961 plan for housing in the far West Village. By 1960, Jane Jacobs had emerged as a local hero and, as a result of her opposition to urban renewal plans. But the 1961 battle over the village also turned her into a national hero. Her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, came out this year amidst the protest over the city's plans for the village in '61. And press coverage of the neighborhood dispute helped to give Jacobs a national platform. The celebratory narrative of grassroots organizing, though, this narrative that activists saved neighborhood streets from hostile government planning, sometimes, it worries me, obscures the complexity of private and public investment in the built environment. And I think that it's inadvertently valorized neoliberal policies that have actually left a lot of urban change to private initiative, pushing away, right, public responsibilities to shape our urban landscapes. And this is one of the things I want to explore. And so let's look at what the city's plan for the far West Village actually entailed. The City Planning Commission's proposal represented, in fact, a new approach to renewal that tried in a lot of ways to correct what were seen as some of the problems with 1950s style urban renewal projects, and really distance the commission from what Mayor Wagner, what Robert Wagner and other commission members were already starting to call the bulldozer approach that was most commonly associated with Robert Moses, the former planning commissioner. In 1961, in fact, Wagner replaced Moses with housing advocate, philanthropist, and developer James Felt as head of the City Planning Commission. And that same year, in 61, he also established a preservation committee that was charged with working with Felt, implementing new plans for the city. So let's look at some of the things that the plan entailed. Excuse me just a second. On the one hand, planners took into account some of the recent changes that had been made to the 19th century landscape of townhouses just across the street from where we are. They recognized the charm of the village and many of these recent renovations, and therefore promised to, quote, protect and encourage the private rehabilitation which has already taken place in the area in recent years. Instead of wholesale clearance, the Commission proposed what it was calling selective clearance, or selective, rather, clearance. This would entail selecting out particularly vulnerable properties, but not the kind of blanket clearance that had characterized earlier renewal. So it would be selective clearance of selected tenement buildings that couldn't be restructured, the elimination of some non-residential structures like factories, warehouses, and freight garages on the blocks east of Washington Street that could be used to make way for middle and low-income housing. For these sections west of Washington Street, the Commission recommended removal of the obsolete railroad tracks and redevelopment of the corridor between Washington and West Streets for light industrial use. The Commissioner's plan also even recognized the need for artist housing, and in fact proposed using a large number of what it was calling loft structures for artist studios. So there's sort of a lot of interesting elements, right, that have been generally forgotten about what this plan actually entailed. Proponents of the plan saw public housing as a tool for regulating economic speculation and controlling gentrification. The Citizens Housing and Planning Council hailed the plan, in fact, for its emphasis on what it called conservation, rehabilitation, and redevelopment. Let's see, this is actually a map, and so it's interesting to note that the area of study was just south of where we are right now. So the Westbeth, the Bell Labs site wasn't ever in the plan, but its direct proximity to it would have a sort of huge consequences in the plans that would follow after the defeat. These are some images of the protests in support of the 1961 plan. I just want to list some of the organizations that were proponents of the new plan. The Middle Income Cooperatives of the Village, or MICO, the Citizens Union, the Citizens Housing and Planning Council, the International Longshoremen's Association, the New York City Central Labor Council, and the New York chapter of Artists' Equity Association. All of them, right, advocated public housing so that working class New Yorkers could stay in their neighborhoods. For planners, for many planners, I should say, urban renewal had long represented a way to keep the middle class in New York. And the Citizens Housing and Planning Council said that, quote, if the neighborhood is to be kept from sliding either into luxury redevelopment or commercial decay, planning must be done. Neighbors Association leader James Kirk likewise argued that government intervention into housing seemed to be the only defense against rising rents and the increasing eviction of low-income families from the village. He said, quote, those who oppose this study are ensuring that these evictions will continue. But activists opposed to the plan in the village painted a very different picture of what the plan entailed. And they did so with rather broad strokes. They criticized big housing projects based on their aesthetic and their social merits. And they flattened most urban renewal programs, whether we're talking about public housing or the building of cultural institutions or highway building, all by the same characteristics that basically framed them as collusion between government and private interests. The Committee to Save the West Village, the group that Jane Jacobs organized a really sophisticated communications campaign to get the attention of local papers. Jacobs and her allies staged elaborate stunts, like traveling to public meetings at City Hall in a tourist trolley that had been decorated by Salvador Dali, and attending public hearings while wearing glasses that had been covered with giant X's on the lenses to evoke the X's applied to condemned properties. They also conducted surveys of existing conditions to counter arguments of blight, and they lobbied very successfully local representatives in an election year. They ultimately succeeded in defeating the city's 1961 renewal plan. And defeat of that plan, right, is frequently represented as a watershed moment in urban history. One in which planners changed the way that they thought about urban space and the human scale of cities. Large-scale renewal became discredited, and a new era of community involvement began. And all this is surely true. But the defeat of the 1961 renewal plan also opened up the door to private real estate development. And it left open the question about what to do with abandoned industrial buildings. So let's move to talking about the Westbeth Coalition. Roger Stevens and Jack Kaplan, that's Roger Stevens on the right, and Jack Kaplan and his wife Alice in the image to the left and the right, sorry. Stevens and Kaplan saw the Bell Labs property as a bold opportunity to subsidize the arts by providing federally financed housing at affordable rates. When the Bell Labs buildings were put up for sale in '66, Stevens and Kaplan quickly snapped them up and built Westbeth as a new model for artist housing. They hoped that it would benefit individual artists, that it would foster American culture, and at the same time, redefine the use of abandoned warehouse and factory buildings. When he was introducing the project in 1967, Stevens said, quote, "Artist housing is one of the most crucial needs of this country at this time. Our artists need a place to live and work, and at a price that they can afford to pay." The National Council on the Arts and the Kaplan Fund provided $750,000 matching grants to purchase the buildings from Bell Labs, while the Federal Housing Administration provided a federally guaranteed mortgage through the Bankers Trust to finance their renovation. Stevens and Kaplan were well-known Democratic Party fundraisers, and they brought with them very influential contacts in Washington and among New York's financial, cultural, and political elite. They used their personal and institutional connections to secure favorable terms for financing and to negotiate with the FHA to create a new category of artist housing that would meet FHA standards. And they used it to negotiate with the city's planning commission to rezone this waterfront district in the village for residential use. To coordinate the legal and financial details necessary to convert factories, the Kaplan Fund hired a team of architects, lawyers, and administrators. Kaplan's daughter, Joan Davidson, worked very closely with Richard Meyer, the architect, and Westbeth's new administrator, Dixon Bain, to push Westbeth's plans through city and federal authorization, and to coordinate construction and the selection of tenants. The Kaplan Fund also created a nonprofit housing corporation called Westbeth, which of course drew its name from the surrounding streets, evoking in its clever simplicity a new cultural identity for the Lower West Side. The kind of this kind of high-stakes collaboration between a prominent foundation like the Kaplan Fund and federal agencies like the NEA and the FHA really belies the mythic narrative of pioneering artists who carved out loft spaces for themselves in the urban wilderness. The era of singular individuals like Robert Moses, who had the power to develop large sections of the city, might have ended, but big projects like Westbeth still required political and economic connections. Kaplan, Stevens, Davidson all provided Westbeth with the cultural and political clout to attract the national attention of planners, architects, and developers. They also recruited prominent art world figures, like Metropolitan Museum curator Henry Geldzaler, the artist Robert Rauschenberg, Elaine de Kooning, James Rosati, and Saul DeWitt, several curators at MoMA, the directors of the Metropolitan Museum and the Whitney Museum, and the directors of several other prominent cultural and educational institutions in the city. And with its influential sponsors, Westbeth sought to bring artist housing really to the center of American cultural policy in the 1960s. I'm going to skip through this little section on zoning and what artists were starting to call in the popular press the Loft Cause, illustrating the scarcity of workspace in the city, and move to some of my observations about what I see to be Westbeth's legacy, with the hope, right, that we can come back and perhaps talk about some of these zoning issues in the Q&A. Perhaps Westbeth's greatest legacy was its aesthetic success. Richard Meyer won an award in '71 from the AIA for the project, and critics hailed Westbeth as a triumph of design and a new form of cool urban living. I want to look at a few images that were circulating in popular and cultural presses and architectural presses right after the opening, because they sort of illustrate what was, at the time, a startlingly new concept in urban living, but one that very quickly got picked up on. And this idea had, I would argue, really profound consequences for sort of a shift in ideas about urban housing and indeed private development. In her review in the New York Times of Westbeth, Ada Louise Huxtable wrote, quote, "No trumpet sounded when Westbeth triumphed over the system, but they should have." She argued that Kaplan, Davidson, Meyer, and Stevens had successfully manipulated existing rules for real estate development in the 60s. She wrote that, quote, it bent, but it didn't break almost every FHA regulation in the book. In order to qualify for an FHA secured mortgage, Westbeth's architectural design needed to meet federal criteria for apartments planned to serve low to moderate income residents. Because the FHA had very little, no familiarity with the needs of artists, its standard criteria for families was calculated square footage and the number of bedrooms. But Meyer insisted that Westbeth could only work as an artist residence if it provided open spaces with no partitions. Meyer eventually won authorization for Westbeth's apartments by submitting plans to the FHA with dotted lines that would approximate bedrooms and kitchen partitions. While in actuality, tenants were provided with the all-familiar rolling modular closets that could be used to separate out spaces. Huxtable went on to say that Westbeth sparked New York's special zoning district. It's an experiment and prototype in the provision of the kind of loft accommodations needed by artists, legislated against by most city codes, and rapidly disappearing from the commercial market. during a publicity tour for Westbeth, right around the time of the opening, Dixon Bain brought reporters to the roof of the tallest building in the complex. And from the roof, they surveyed the surrounding landscape, and Bain kind of gave a tour and a projection of his ideas for the future redevelopment of this industrial landscape. Looking south, you could see the 6 blocks where the West Village houses would replace empty warehouses. To the immediate east, the newly renovated townhouses stretched out to the more sort of populous center of Greenwich Village. But it was to the waterfront that Bain gestured with the most enthusiasm. Reporter Michael Leach observed, he wrote, that, quote, beyond the highway, the chipped and fading but still imposing late Victorian piers fingered out into the water, their uses reduced to freight transfer, to lighterage. Bain pointed in that direction, and he stabbed the air with his finger and said, look at those piers. Can you imagine the West Side Highway put underground and pedestrian bridges built across to those piers? They could be refurbished and made into skating rinks and restaurants and parks. Bain and Davidson, in fact, had their eyes on those old piers as possible sites for more artist studios, and they were in fact in negotiation with their owner, the Penn Central Company. Bain went on to say, to complain, New York just doesn't use its waterfront. Those piers should be just like the Piazza San Marco. So many things could be done. Unfortunately, Westbeth failed to fulfill many of its primary ambitions as either an incubator for the arts in the way that Stevens and Kaplan conceived of it, or as a model for future nonprofit affordable rental loans. The city's economy in the 1970s prevented the kind of regenerative growth in waterfront neighborhoods that Bain had hoped Westbeth could bring. Westbeth also never filled its ground floor rental spaces, so it failed to pay for its initial investment. And it struggled for many years to meet its operating expenses. After decades of deindustrialization and the loss of its middle class, New York's economy was crumbling by the time that Westbeth opened in 1970. Nonetheless, a new market in lofts took off at exactly the same time Westbeth opened. In many ways, locking in many of the artists who had moved here. In 1971, zoning restrictions on living in lofts were eased when Soho was designated as an artist district. And what this did was enable landlords to legally put lofts on the market, but at rents that were beyond the means of many struggling artists. Rather than moving out after 5 years, the majority of the artists who moved into Westbeth when it opened stayed here. But Westbeth did change ideas about urban planning and development. It provided a new business model for many developers who recognized the aesthetic and the cultural value of industrial spaces. After the complex's groundbreaking in 1968, Emily Genauer predicted in the New York Post that Westbeth would revitalize the entire Lower West Side. She wrote that, quote, the lives of their neighbors in Greenwich Village, to whom the public facilities will also be available, will be greatly improved. While the old Bell Telephone Complex is admittedly unique, if the Wreckers Ball can be stopped in time, there will still be available innumerable ugly 19th century factories and warehouses in New York and in mill towns across the country, susceptible to the imagination and visionary transformation. As early as 1969, a Citizens Planning and Housing Council report identified industrial structures along the West and Washington Street corridor as assets for redevelopment. These were buildings that only a decade earlier had been deemed blighted and subject for renewal. So it's really a remarkable, right, transformation. And it's one that Westbeth was really sort of the forefront in pushing. Davidson and Bain courted the local and national press to generate interest in the project. So it's not really surprising that Westbeth elicited the kind of enthusiasm that it did, especially from cultural and architectural critics. Henry Geldzahler had anticipated such an interest when he said in 1967, it's really avant-garde to move into this area. The architecture critic, Peter Blake, had first joked that to him, a scheme to put close to 400 artists into a single 625,000 square foot brick box seemed, quote, like a surefire prescription for a latter-day Dante's Inferno. But after visiting Westbeth in 1970, Blake said that, quote, it seems to be just about the best place you can find to live in Manhattan. He in fact called Westbeth a downtown Dakota, with some of the same, quote, massive portals and long, if cut-rate, Marienbad corridors. Wandering the building's labyrinth hallways, he imagined, quote, strange, undiscovered lofts and garrets and penthouses somewhere up there in the rafters. Now, designations of the area by prominent cultural figures like Henry Geldzahler and Peter Blake as avant-garde and allusions to art house cult classics like Last Year at Marienbad helped to give converted industrial buildings cultural cachet. They also helped to fuel speculative interest in converted lots in the 1970s. At the same time, it also raised concern among many struggling artists who recognized the connection that would lead to escalating costs. In 1969, Ron Rosenbaum suggested in The Voice that a lot of artists were starting, this is a year, right, before Westbeth opened, were starting to express concern about Westbeth. He said that depending on who you talk to, Westbeth will either, quote, be an exciting community of creative people or an inadequate, horrifying artist ghetto. Many artists, he said, were complaining about FHA regulations that allocated space according to family size. Some of them argued that, quote, the largest units go to those who have produced the most babies, but not who produce the largest scale art. For artists who looked to Westbeth as an answer to housing needs, the realities of federal housing policy, the economics of space in New York led to what really seemed like broken promises. But by providing subsidized affordable rents to low-income artists, Westbeth offered a kind of loft regulation that in some ways supplemented increasing costs in Soho. And at least this is an argument that Joan Davidson made. She wrote a rebuttal to Ron Rosenbaum's article in The Voice, and she said that Westbeth is an experiment. It is a complementary, not competing, effort in the movement to save Soho, in that it takes a little bit of pressure off of demand for rent, for lofts. Defending Westbeth and the FHA, Davidson cited what she called, quote, the democratic concept that public money should buy good space for the greatest number, rather than ideal space for the few. Westbeth's lofts never rivaled those in Soho, but Westbeth residents were offered larger spaces than most artists could secure on the private market at comparable rents. It's important to remember that the artists who lived at Westbeth all qualified as low-income residents by FHA criteria, and the lucky ones who did get in attained security against the kind of rent increases that affected many artists in Soho later in the 1970s. Mike Ackerman, the first chairman of the ad hoc committee of tenants here at Westbeth, summed up the sentiment of many Westbeth artists when he said, most of us are here because there was nowhere else to go. Nonetheless, he insisted that for most of us, it's a big improvement over whatever roach-infested, tiny, crowded fire trap we came from. Westbeth's commercial spaces didn't attract galleries or restaurants and bars like the storefronts in Soho eventually would. And it would be decades before the surrounding area in the West Village underwent the kind of private reinvestment and gentrification that Soho experienced much earlier. But Westbeth artists still developed a very vibrant artistic community here. Today, Westbeth stands out on the waterfront almost as dramatically as it had in the 1960s. But whereas it had once been an outlier as a center for scientific invention in an otherwise industrial district, today it stands out as a nonprofit housing complex for moderate income tenants, all in the middle of one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the nation. The democratic ideal of providing affordable housing for as many artists as possible never materialized beyond Westbeth and a few other smaller co-ops. The combined effect of collapsing urban economies and declining federal investment left newly popularized industrial spaces along waterfronts, railroads, and other peripheral urban areas to the private market. The popular fascination with converted lofts and the critical success of Westbeth proved to private developers that there was a potential market for renovated industrial buildings. New York and many other cities in the late 70s and 80s would respond to this change in real estate values by easing zoning restrictions, but they would do very, very little to stem a fevered speculative market in converted lofts that would make former industrial corridors unaffordable for the working people who used to labor and live here. While Westbeth helped to eventually spur urban revitalization, its democratic goals unfortunately dropped out of the developmental model for Loft